Thomas Cromwell closed his eyes, bracing for the final blow as the executioner raised his axe high. Once one of the most powerful men in England, he was now moments away from meeting the Reaper. The crowd held its breath as the blade sliced through the air, but not through Thomas. The executioner shuffled slightly. This never usually happens. What twisted fate awaits, and what more horrors await the condemned on this episode of the Infographics Show? Find out on Executions That Went Horribly Wrong, Part 2. Number 20. Thomas Cromwell. When it came to being king, Henry VIII was pretty unpredictable. He was a force of nature driven by desires that could change on a whim, and no one knew that better than Thomas Cromwell, his chief minister. A skilled lawyer and a proponent of English Reformation, Cromwell shepherded in many of the changes to the English government and helped arrange the annulment of the king's first marriage. This also included the formation of a new English church. This kind of power doesn't come without its risks, though, and by 1540 Cromwell had made many enemies. And when he fell hard. Cromwell had made an enemy of Anne Boleyn, Henry's fiery second wife, and orchestrated her execution, which incidentally won the king's favor. But this next move proved to be fatal. After arranging a disastrous third marriage to Anne of Cleves, Cromwell was accused of treason by enemies, stripped of his titles, and sentenced to death. Eyewitnesses report that the executioner took 3 swings to sever his head, raising the possibility that the execution was drawn out to punish Cromwell, no doubt pleasing his enemies. One who wasn't pleased, the king, who was said to deeply regret losing his most skilled advisor. But time marched on, and so did execution methods. Number 19. Margaret Dixon. In 1724, the Green Market of Edinburgh was a popular marketplace, but it also served a darker purpose, hosting public executions regularly. And one victim was Margaret Dixon, a fishwife whose husband had recently joined, or rather been forced to join, the Royal Navy. Margaret was forced to find work at the local inn, where she got up to some indiscretions. It wouldn't do to have a 1-year-old baby after her husband got back from a 3-year hitch, so she left her out-of-wedlock child on the banks of the River Tweed. The baby's body was found, Dixon was fingered, and was quickly condemned to hang in the public square for murder most foul. But there was a big twist coming to this story. She was hanged and pronounced dead, likely to the cheers of onlookers, and her body was to be given to medical students for dissection. But after an altercation with her family, which believed her innocent, her body was turned over for burial, and that's when the family heard something odd. Noises were coming from inside of her coffin. She was alive, having survived her hanging. Now this created a paradox, as her sentence hadn't fully been carried out. There was nothing that could be done except to set her free and let her return to her husband for a really awkward conversation. Hopefully her family's beliefs about her character were more accurate than the law. A once-in-a-lifetime situation? Maybe not. Number 18. Anne Green. Nearly a century earlier, in 1650, Anne Green found herself condemned to an equally harrowing fate. As a domestic maid in the home of a justice of the peace, Anne's life took a dark turn after an affair with the judge's teenage grandson. When she suffered a miscarriage, she tried desperately to keep it hidden, but the remains were discovered, and Anne became the scapegoat. Accused of infanticide, with her powerful employer leading the charge, her fate seemed sealed. Even a midwife's testimony that the fetus was stillborn, too underdeveloped to survive, couldn't save her. She was quickly convicted and sentenced to hang. Justice was blind, but maybe a higher power wasn't. She was hanged at Oxford Castle, with a soldier even trying to speed up her death by hitting her with the butt of his rifle. After she was pronounced dead, she was turned over to a physician for dissection, and they discovered that she had a faint pulse. This led to a series of experiments to try to revive her, including bloodletting with leeches and a tobacco smoke enema. Basically a 17th century healing hack TikTok would totally overhype. Anne eventually woke up, fully recovered, and was soon pardoned. This was helped by the fact that the judge who masterminded her hanging had died only 3 days later, so there was no one to protest, and she wound up living another 15 years. But no English criminal facing the gallows had the luck of this man. Number 17. John Smith. No, not that one, although he did not treat Pocahontas well in real life. This rogue was a London burglar in the late 17th and early 18th century, and his life of crime eventually sent him to meet his fate. It didn't take too much to get sentenced to death in those days, and in 1705 he was sent to the gallows. He seemed oddly unconcerned by this and somehow managed to survive hanging from his neck for 15 minutes. Eventually the crowd, probably bored, called out for mercy and he was cut down. He He recovered and he was given a formal reprieve, with authorities hoping he would turn over a new leaf. Yeah, not so much. Within a year, Smith was back to his old ways. He was acquitted on his next trial, and the third time he was likely to be convicted, the judge died right before the trial started. It seemed like fate was on his side, so he decided to try his luck one more time. In 1727, he was convicted of theft, and while most agreed his theft of a padlock was part of a larger conspiracy to burgle a warehouse, they weren't trying their luck at the gallows again. Smith was sentenced to transportation, and he was packed on a ship bound for Virginia, where his fate is unknown but probably involved at least a few more crimes. But to the south in France, they weren't nearly as kind. Number 16. Robert François Damiens. It was 1757 and Louis XV sat on the throne, and he had for almost his entire life. He was considered one of France's greatest kings, but not everyone was a fan. Damiens was an army veteran currently working as a servant, and his erratic behavior led him to be fired repeatedly. Many believed he was mentally unstable and driven by religious radicalism. Consumed by anger over the king's refusal to support the Jansenist sect, he decided to take matters into his own hands. As King Louis XV approached his carriage, Damiens struck, plunging a blade into the monarch. But luck was on the king's side. Louis XV was only lightly injured, thanks to his thick winter coat. Damiens was arrested and sentenced to death for attempted regicide. And for his crime, there would only be one punishment. While most criminals in France would face hanging or beheading, Damiens was sentenced to dismemberment, which would be carried out by horses running in opposite directions. Damiens had already been tortured in multiple ways, including being burned before his execution, and when the horses had to do their work, they couldn't quite finish the job, leaving Damiens in agony until the royal executioner put an end to his misery. It was a horrible spectacle, one that the crowd cheered on. But maybe some people had second thoughts. This was the last execution by dismemberment in France, and ironically, the royal executioner who carried it out would wind up executing the next king during the Reign of Terror. And this next man seemed determined to push his luck to the very end. Number 15. Joseph Samuel. A German immigrant to Britain, Joseph Samuel wasted no time getting a bad reputation, but he would quickly no longer be the crown's problem, as he was sentenced to transportation to an isolated prison colony in Australia. The desolate location was almost guaranteed to kill anyone who tried to escape, but Samuel saw that as a challenge. The rogue convict fled and robbed the home of a rich woman, killing a guard who was serving as her security guard. At trial, he was identified by the woman and sentenced to death by hanging, the only one of the gang to be convicted. But finishing him off wouldn't be so simple. In 1803, Samuels and a convict from another case were driven to the gallows. The method was to hang them from a cart, which would drive away and leave them suspended. This caused slow strangulation, which killed the other convict, but Samuel's rope snapped, leading to a fall and a nasty ankle injury. The executioner quickly fashioned another rope and set him up to be hanged again, only for that noose to slip off his neck. A third attempt also led to a snapped rope, and the crowd was in an uproar, believing God himself to be intervening. After the governor showed up, he agreed to commute Samuel's sentence to a life of hard labor in the Kingstown mines. Samuel and 7 others would later try to escape the settlement, but their boat sank, and his body was never found. But across the pond, there would be no angel for our next convict. Number 14. Paula Angel. In 1861, the Wild West was a lawless frontier where justice was swift and mercy was in short supply. If you were convicted of any of a series of crimes, you would likely be facing the gallows. Paula Angel was only 19 and the daughter of a prominent family in the town of Las Vegas. No, not that Las Vegas. This is a town in New Mexico. So people were shocked when she was charged with a serious crime. First-degree murder. She had reportedly been having an affair with a married father of 5, and when things went south, she reportedly stabbed him. But from the start, things about the trial were odd. The family of the murdered man were powerful and managed to sway the judge, who refused to let the jury consider lesser charges. Death was the only allowed sentence for this crime. She was found guilty, and things only got worse from there. While she was granted an appeal, no stay of execution was granted, and the judge ordered the execution to go ahead while the appeal was still pending. There were no gallows available, so she was hung from a cottonwood tree. Her arms weren't restrained, so she grabbed onto the noose to try to prevent herself from choking. The crowd was outraged and eventually cut her down, but the sheriff stepped in, fended off the crowd, and successfully hanged her. The case gained notoriety even then, but today it's generally considered as one of the most notable injustices in the Old West. The only place more dangerous than the West? Let's return to the Outback. Number 13. Henry Joseph Mans. Australia was a wild, partially untamed frontier in the 1860s with large stretches of isolated territory that could hold many dangers. One of those was bushrangers, the Australian equivalent of highwaymen, who would rob passing travelers. Many were escaped convicts who had been transported there, but not Henry Joseph Mans. He was a native-born Australian who joined the infamous Gardner Hall gang. Together, they pulled off the Ugowra robbery, which liberated a massive amount of gold and banknotes from a coach. Mans was captured, later rescued from the jail by his gang, but eventually recaptured and sentenced to death. And when it came time for the gallows, things would go horribly wrong. Many members of the public felt he had only played a minor role in the robbery, and he should be freed, but the hangman would not be denied. The actual hanging would be a disturbing spectacle, as the noose slipped and covered part of his face, rather than sitting firmly around his neck. Mans was left convulsing and bleeding from his nostrils as he frantically tried to remove the rope. The hangman was forced to lift Mans up to get the noose back around his neck, by which point the public was angry and demanded a reprieve. But none would come, and the sad, slow death of Henry Joseph Mans would go down as one of the darkest in Australia's convict era. Even the polite men of Canada could get up to some nasty stuff. Number 12. Thomas Scott. Thomas Scott was an Irish Protestant who had moved to Canada to work as a laborer. While laboring on a road-building project in 1870, he fell in with the Canadian Party, a faction of religious hardliners. This group found itself at odds with the Red River Rebellion, a militant movement fighting for an autonomous government in what is now Manitoba. Scott's involvement led to his capture by the rebels, but he managed a daring escape, only to return and attempt to free fellow prisoners. His act of defiance ended in recapture, and tensions with his captors escalated quickly. After conflicts with his captors, he was convicted of insubordination and sentenced to death. But could what came next even be considered an execution? The Red River Rebellion was not a formal government and had no legal authority to execute anyone, but they did have guns, and Scott was sentenced to death by firing squad, a relatively new execution method for the time. But this wasn't exactly a polished firing squad. The executioners were a group of men using ordinary hunting muskets, and eyewitnesses said many of them were drunk. The result was a lot of scattered firing, with only 2 bullets hitting Scott, who collapsed with non-lethal wounds. Another gunman came up to shoot Scott in the head, and he managed to finish the job, which we suppose is why executioners are usually trained and sober. This next execution was at least fast, but it certainly put on a show. Number 11. Thomas Blackjack Ketchum. Cowboys had the run of the West, and it was easy to find work, even if the work wasn't easy. That may have led one cowboy, Thomas Ketchum, to break bad. By 1892, he had joined a gang with his brother and several others, and they had a big score in mind. They were going to rob a train. After getting away with their loot, their reign of terror would continue, and they would soon be tied to multiple murders. But their luck would end in a botched holdup that left Sam Ketchum dead, and Black Jack was on the run. The ruthless cowboy would attempt to pull off the same heist weeks later, and this time he would be wounded by the armed train conductor and captured. And in the West, justice was swift and harsh. Ketchum's arm would have to be amputated due to his injuries, and the medical staff would nurse him back to health, just so he could be tried, convicted, and executed. There was just one problem: this was the first execution in this county of New Mexico, and they didn't have an executioner. Ketchum had also gained a significant amount of weight in prison, and the rope was too long, so when Ketchum was dropped through the trap door, his neck didn't break, it came right off. Ketchum was decapitated in front of multiple horrified witnesses, and it had to be sewn back onto his body for viewing. Got any thoughts on these botched executions? Drop them in the comments. Now let's head on to the Deep South, where fate was often brutal and unfair. Number 10. Willie Francis. Willie Francis didn't look like he belonged on death row. In fact, he looked more like he should be in high school. The African-American Louisiana resident was only 16 years old when he was convicted of the murder of a pharmacy owner who had recently employed him in 1945. Francis confessed under intense interrogation, and that made the trial an open and shut case for the prosecution. Francis was quickly sentenced to death, still allowed for juveniles in those days, and black residents of the South rarely had any chance at an appeal. It would soon be time for the teenager to have a date with old Sparky. But his journey to the electric chair would have some literally shocking twists. The electric chair was still the newest method of execution, and there were some kinks to work out. The chair in Louisiana, nicknamed Gruesome Gertie, wasn't set up properly by a drunk prison guard, and it shocked Francis badly, but not enough to kill him. He could be heard pleading to the guards to let him be free. After the electricity had died down, Francis was still alive. A powerful attorney took his case and argued that it would be cruel and unusual punishment to try to execute Francis again, and in another time or in another state it might have worked. But the justice system for African Americans in the Jim Crow South was usually just a formality, and Francis's appeals were rejected. He would return to the electric chair in 1947, now 18, and this time it would be successful. And to this day, his actual guilt is hotly debated. It was one of the most controversial executions in U.S. history, only next to this one. Number 9. Ethel Rosenberg. It was the height of the Cold War, and the two spies were accused of one of the most shocking crimes in American history, helping the Soviets get the atomic bomb. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted, with the government putting intense pressure even on their family members to testify against them. Both Julius and Ethel were sentenced to death for espionage. That wasn't a surprise, but many claimed that while Julius was likely guilty as sin, Ethel may have been little more than a pawn damned by close association. But in the political climate of 1953, she had little hope of a reprieve. And there would be one more dark twist to her story. Julius was executed smoothly, dying from the first electric shock, but Ethel would have a much harder last act. It took 3 bursts of electricity to pronounce her dead. Or was she? When the doctors examined her, they found she still had a faint pulse. She was strapped back in, 2 more electric shocks were sent coursing through her body, and witnesses claimed they saw smoke rising from her head after the executions. Now let's head far, far away to look at one of the strangest executions of all time. Number 8. Maru. In Sri Lanka, the name Maru struck fear into the hearts of locals. This infamous bandit, born Dedua Sirpala, was a gangster since he was a teenager, and most of his crimes were fairly petty. He began a relationship with a widow who already had 7 children, and they had a daughter together, as well as an illegal liquor operation. He was still on the run when he was convicted in absentia for a murder and sentenced to death, but broke out of prison to see his daughter. When he was captured this time, there would be no escape from the gallows, but there would be some very strange goings-on before he expired. Sira was to be hanged at the Bogambara prison in Kandy, and before his execution on August 4, 1975, the prison guards gave him a heavy dose of sedatives. This may have been just to keep him from escaping, something he was very good at. There was just one problem: he didn't wake up. He had to be dragged to the gallows, propped up and laid on the trapdoor, and when he fell from the lower distance, he strangled to death slowly, or so it seemed. To witnesses, it may have seemed as if the prison had just executed a dead man. And nearby in Thailand, another disturbing tale of murder and incompetence was unfolding. Number 7. Gayu Lung. It was 1979, and Gayu Lung was under arrest. The Thai woman was accused of a shocking crime, conspiring to kidnap her former employer's son. After being dismissed from her job as a housekeeper and a nanny, she and her boyfriend executed a bold plan. They would pick the boy up from school and demand a ransom of 200,000 baht for his safe return. When the parents missed the drop-off point, her co-conspirators murdered the boy, although she tried to stop them. When news of the monstrous killing surfaced, she was at the center of it and was sentenced to death by firing squad. Just like the ransom attempt, her execution would not go smoothly or quickly. She was brought to the firing squad only a day after being sentenced, and a volley of bullets hit her. The officers examined her, pronounced her dead, and she was transported to the morgue. There, like something out of a horror movie, the medical examiners found her screaming and trying to get up from the slab. None of the bullets hit her heart. This was such an infamous case that the authorities didn't want to waste any time. She was taken right back to the firing squad, and a second volley of bullets made sure there wouldn't be a third. Deep in the heart of Texas, some dark things are happening. Number 6. Stephen McCoy. A serial killer was haunting Texas, and they seemed to be escalating. The first victim was a murder for hire, but after that, a woman and a teenage girl turned up dead, seemingly killed just for money and thrills. It turned out to be not one killer but 2, Stephen McCoy and James Pastor. The sadistic partners were both sentenced to death by lethal injection in 1983, with their accomplice Gary LeBlanc getting a life sentence after testifying against them. Pastor's execution would be marred by him claiming to have murdered 2 other women, but he was never convicted of either because, well, he was dead. But that's nothing compared to the show that awaited when McCoy met the Reaper. Lethal injection was still fairly new as an execution method at this point, and the drugs could be unpredictable. As the drugs were injected, his body started to heave, and he gasped, choked, and arched his back as if he was trying to get off the gurney. It was a disturbing, prolonged process, and the chaos wasn't just in the death chamber. One witness reportedly fainted and knocked over another witness. The only explanation the authorities had was that the drugs can affect different people in different ways, and it was one of the first signs that lethal injection was not the perfectly clean method they were hoping for. So it's no surprise that other methods still had their believers. Number 5. David Scarborough Lawson. In Greensboro, North Carolina, David Scarborough Lawson had been sitting on death row for 13 years for a brutal double murder of 2 members of the Shin family. But time was running out and he would soon face death. But not by lethal injection or the electric chair. He would be getting the gas chamber, a rare method of execution by 1994. But it was still an option in North Carolina, one that was supposed to be relatively foolproof and painless. It involved flooding the room with poison gas with the inmate safely strapped down. But in complex machines, things can go horribly wrong. At this point, the preferred method for the gas chamber was to drop cyanide pellets into a bowl of sulfuric acid, creating a toxic gas. But as this happened, the acid splashed out of the tank directly onto Lawson's leg, causing him searing pain and leading to him straining so hard that the strap on his leg broke. Witnesses reported him kicking and screaming, "I am human," multiple times until his screams got more and more quiet. The gas chamber was reformed, adding splash guards to prevent leakage, but it was only used one more time before the execution method was retired for good in the Tar Heel state. For this next killer, the execution was only the end of a long, disturbing road. Number 4. Ricky Ray Rector. In 1981, Rector and some friends tried to get into a dance hall. When one couldn't pay the cover price, Rector did the only thing that made sense. He shot randomly into the hall, hitting and killing Arthur D. Criswell. The hot-tempered murderer went on the run, spending 3 days hiding in the woods before being convinced to give it up. He offered to surrender to a specific officer, Robert Martin, who he had known for a long time. And when Martin showed up, Rector shot and killed him as well. Before he could be arrested, he turned the gun on himself but survived, causing himself severe brain damage similar to a lobotomy. But in Arkansas, that wouldn't stop the wheels of justice. After surviving brain surgery, the severely compromised Rector was put on trial. While he seemed barely aware of what was going on around him, he was convicted and sentenced to death. There were plenty of appeals arguing that he didn't have the mental capacity to even understand what was happening. He reportedly planned to save his dessert from his last meal for later. But when he was taken to the death chamber, things went horribly wrong. Rector was a very heavy man, and it took the medical team more than 50 minutes to find a vein to inject the lethal drugs in. This led to the disturbing spectacle of Rector moaning and yelling before he was finally put to death. Then Governor Bill Clinton even returned from the presidential campaign trail to ensure the execution went smoothly. Nothing could spare this next killer, not even his victim's family. Number 3. Joe Nathan James Jr. Alabama was a notoriously strict state when it came to capital punishment, similar to Texas and Arkansas, and Joe Nathan James Jr. was an infamous resident of death row. He was in a relationship with Faith Hall, but she eventually rejected him, and that sent him spiraling, and he spent months stalking and harassing her before ambushing her in her apartment and killing her in 1994. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death after 2 trials, with the first verdict being overturned due to evidence issues. But he would spend over 20 years on death row before facing the death chamber in 2022. And in that time, he would pick up some unlikely supporters. Faith's family came to oppose the execution, with her daughters saying they forgave him and they wanted his sentence commuted to life. But it wasn't to be, and his execution had several irregularities around it. He didn't show any signs of consciousness during the execution, and he wasn't sedated. An autopsy showed he had many puncture wounds around his knuckles and wrists, indicating many failed attempts to insert the drugs. This was one of many incidents that led to Alabama instituting a 1-year moratorium on capital punishment. But the state would be back in the news soon enough. Number 2. Alan Eugene Miller. It's rare for a new execution method to make its debut, but Alabama recently introduced nitrogen hypoxia. It's a controversial process that replaces oxygen in the air with pure nitrogen, causing the condemned to suffocate in a silent, unseen death. When the state suggested it as an alternative due to the shortage of lethal injection drugs, many inmates opted for it, knowing they would have to wait until the method was perfected and approved. One of those inmates was Alan Miller, who had killed 3 of his co-workers over supposed rumors that they were spreading about him. Although the defense claimed he was severely mentally ill, he was convicted and sentenced to death. But he wouldn't be facing the Reaper anytime soon. Miller was convicted in 1999, and he had his first date with death in 2022. He was slated to die by lethal injection, but Miller was obese, and it took several failed attempts to find a suitable vein before the execution was called off. After an appeal, Alabama agreed to hold off and not put him through lethal injection again. It would be only 2 more years before everyone signed off on nitrogen hypoxia as a method. Ironically, Miller's turn as a guinea pig went much more smoothly, and he was executed without incident, only the second to die by this method. But no other execution was as alarming to those watching as this one. Number 1. Pedro Medina. Pedro Medina's journey from Cuba to America on the Mariel boat lift in 1980 was supposed to be a fresh start. But just 2 years after his arrival, the former refugee was arrested in Orlando for the murder of a 52-year-old woman. The brutal killing combined with his erratic behavior made it clear he was responsible, and despite plenty of doubts about his competency, he was sentenced to death. Back then, the electric chair was the primary method, and it got plenty of work out in Florida over the years. But in 1997, things would go horribly wrong and give everyone involved a scare straight out of hell. While Medina professed his innocence at his execution, all of the appeals failed, and he went to his death. But something went terribly wrong. The synthetic sponge meant to ensure the execution went smoothly malfunctioned, failing to provide the necessary moisture. Instead of conducting the current through his body, it sparked violently, igniting flames that shot from his head. Witnesses described the horrifying scene as though he were wearing a horrible crown of fire. This was one of the incidents that led Florida to eventually eliminating the electric chair, with many veterans of execution saying it was the most disturbing one they'd ever seen. What's your take on these botched executions? Should these methods still exist? Share your thoughts in the comments. Want to see what it's like from the other side of the death chamber? Check out what it's like to be a death row executioner, or watch this video instead.